but I feel, yeah, it
I was just
was.
reading this story that said the annual Oscar nominee luncheon is a chance to determine who's ahead in the race for the Academy Awards. Apparently, they can tell at the luncheon by the amount of applause people get. It's a hint of who might actually win the
What?
Oscar. Yeah.
Well, it's
Ooh, it's a
wild
wild idea,
but it just
might
might work. Yeah, the LA Times, and then I want to bring on Joe Ferullo. In fact,
Yeah.
can we bring on Joe now? Because he'll remember what I'm talking about here.
No, listen, as far as the luncheon goes, it's the people who get the surf and turf. They're the ones who are.
They're the winners. Big
Yeah,
winners.
they're the people, I think.
Joe Ferullo, as you know, has been a friend of the show for a long time. Now he's changed gigs. He was writing a column for The Hill on politics and media. Now he's running an outfit called the National Catholic Reporter.
Awesome.
Reporting on Catholicism and Catholic Church-related issues and interesting stuff. But before I get to that, I wanted to remind everybody about an LA Times thing that went down in the last decade. It's what you're talking about, Kim. It's predicting the Oscars. And I wanted Joe to come in on this because I'm sure Joe remembers this. The LA Times interviewed, because Oscar prediction is, all about what you're talking about, right? It's like, how can we read the tea leaves to predict who's going to win and all this stuff? And then the Oscars are ridiculous, and comparing pieces of art and movies is absurd. It's a promotion for Hollywood, but we always say that. But then you get into the horse race thing. So the LA Times, you remember, Joe, they interviewed a bunch of people who were Academy members, but they interviewed a lot of them. And they put together, based on their interviews, their projections for who was going to win the Academy Awards in all categories. And they laid out how they did it, and they laid out the predictions, and I think they were 100% correct, to the point that the Oscars, the Academy Award, the Academy as it's called, said, what the hell are you doing? This is, this destroys our franchise. Part of what we do is the reveal as to who wins. You guys are ruining that reveal. And the LA Times, as I recall, Joe, they backed off. They only did it for the 1 year.
Yeah, they did. And then I think the Academy also sent an email to its members going, hey, please don't do this again. If somebody calls you, please don't. But the LA Times did back off because, look, if you live here in LA and you get the LA Times, the way I do, or even you go online, there are a ton of ads for that, for your consideration.
I see.
A ton. Yeah. And it may even keep that newspaper alive. And I love the LA Times, but sure. Advertising and newspapering, tough stuff these days. So those things are very important to the paper. So I would imagine they would.
All they had to say is, hey, look, dude, if you keep this up, we're going to have to pull our advertising, or even just you intimating that in any way was enough to get.
Yeah, you don't have to say it out loud. It could be very, very godfathery. It could be. What a shame it would be if suddenly there was no advertising in your newspaper.
All right, now let me get on to your main thing.
Mark Thompson Show.
Joe Ferullo is here, and he has written, as I was mentioning before, on media and politics for years now at The Hill. Also has a background in journalism, award-winning journalist. And now running this National Catholic Reporter, the independent news source covering the Catholic Church. And there have been some interesting remarks on the part of the Pope. And I wanted to ask you about them, and you've covered them extensively in your publication. Pope Francis, who I suppose is a progressive pope from the standpoint of some of the public positions he's taken. I mean, again, progressive is all relative, right? I mean,
exactly. But fair.
You're running a institution, and it's a hard thing to move it oftentimes, but to refocus it. But he said in an exclusive interview with the Associated Press, this is Pope Francis now, being homosexual is not a crime. It's not a crime. Yes, but it's a sin, he said. Fine, but first let's distinguish between a sin and a crime. And then he goes on, I wonder if you can maybe flesh it out for us a little bit. This is important because homosexuality is criminalized in, 60 countries?
Yeah, something like that. Yep.
Yeah. So put this position that the Pope has taken in some kind of perspective. First, he's still a very powerful guy. So for him to say this, I mean, is immensely important.
Yeah, look, him just saying it makes headlines. It doesn't mean that the church has suddenly changed its stance on something. And a lot of more conservative Catholics, especially in this country, get really shaky in their boots when he says stuff like that. He's just trying to guide people in some of these things, and it basically takes a lot of people to go along with it. So, carefully, what he said was not changing church theology regarding homosexuality. He said, "Hey, it's a sin, got it, but not all sins are crimes," which are an important thing for Americans and American Catholics to realize. And so, what he's been trying to do throughout his papacy, and a lot lately, is just say, can we just be a little bit of a bigger tent organization and make more people who want to join feel welcome, at least, and listened to and heard? And that's part of that effort. But it's something he has to do very gently and very slowly. I mean, Americans mostly are on board with this sort of thing. We're only 6% of the world's Catholics, so he's got a lot of other people to consider. So he has to kind of go almost half step by half step, and that was a pretty full step example of, hey, you've got a lot of countries here that actively criminalize people who are homosexual, and that's wrong.
Well, what is this?
I'm throwing a story up here. This is something that Pope Francis said most recently, and this is a headline from today. He said the church shouldn't put a label on itself like political party. He says the church is not progressive or conservative. Instead, he said choices and traditions need to be evaluated on whether they follow Christ, which is interesting because when you think about, what the church is telling people to do, you think definitely conservative, but he's saying no, that those labels don't apply.
Yeah, and he's been very big on that. In other words, he's decried things in this country in terms of how some of the bishops have polarized Catholics by waging culture war issues. And his thing is, and that doesn't mean he's a crazy liberal. What he's saying is that's not who we are. We're not about the issues of the day. This is not about, whether these library books belong in your school or not. It's much bigger than that, and you're making it too small. You're shrinking what it means to be a Catholic and a Christian by taking sides on these small issues. Let's think about the bigger things in terms of helping people get through their lives.
It's also important. I thought the gay thing was important because in 11 of those 60-ish countries that make being gay illegal, they'll kill you for being gay.
Exactly.
Africa, Middle East. So to whatever extent you can incrementally take that toxin out of these cultures, it's a good thing.
No, I agree. And again, just by saying it, he knows he's going to make headlines, and it will have some ripple effect. Especially, he said that shortly after, I think, or shortly before he went to Africa. He had been in South Sudan and Republic of Congo. And so he was, on the one hand, he's saying we understand Africa is a very, very important part of the growing church. It's one of the few places on earth where it's growing. And so this is like, okay, by the way, some of those countries do this thing and it's wrong.
So it's an awkward position, and then we'll move on. But I think the Catholic Church finds itself in this awkward position regarding their own complicity in gay sex abuse. I mean, sex abuse of all sorts, but it's just because we're talking about the gay community. Yeah, a lot of it is gay sex abuse. How do they square that? How is that? It's an ongoing thing, I understand. So I'm asking you, as someone who watches it really day to day, how is it being handled, and is that changing? I mean, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's finally being handled better. Not perfectly, but better. But it took a long time to get there, Mark. I mean, the National Catholic Reporter, just for folks who don't know, and most of you don't, is an independent newspaper founded in the 1960s by a bunch of radical Catholics in Kansas City who were caught up in the changes of the 60s and who thought, you know what, we need a paper run by regular folks, journalists who cover the church the way good political reporters cover Washington, D.C., as an institution that has a lot of influence and should be held to account on some things. So we were the first newspaper back in the 1980s that broke the priest abuse scandal. The big break came with the Boston Globe in 2000. it took probably until a couple of years ago for the church to really, really begin to own up to what happened and change in a big way policies. It was happening a little bit at a time in certain parts of the world, but until Francis came along, and even it took him a few years to really get into it, did they really begin to change. And a lot of damage was done along the way to their credibility and their moral credibility, which is what I think you're speaking to, Mark. It's very hard for them to present themselves as moral guideposts on other issues when a lot of Catholics in this country and around the world go, oh, really? Where were you all of those years? And they've begun to address it, but I think they're not fully aware of how long it's going to take and how much effort it's going to take for them to repair the damage.
There was another interesting piece that you did there at National Catholic Reporter, and it was about politics, which you know well, and how the Republican agenda, as it's being articulated and rolled out. I know there are a lot of different voices that are part of that agenda. And I don't mean to be too party specific, but it's a two-party system here. So, you get the whole breadth of political positions on both sides. You were saying in this piece that essentially it doesn't reflect a kind of being a good Christian, if you want to think of it that way, that the values that are Catholic values are not reflected in GOP positions is essentially your point.
Right. This was sort of as the new House was coming in and Kevin McCarthy was finally made the speaker, which, as you know, took quite a while. Our editorial was like, okay, so a lot of you guys got in there by waving the Christian flag and the Catholic flag and using culture wars as a way to get in. Okay, so now that you're there, what are you doing about that? Right? You guys pushed and pushed and pushed, most of you, to get Roe v. Wade off the books, with the promise that, don't worry about it. We'll take care of everybody along the way. Well, okay, what are you going to do about that? So far, we haven't heard from Republicans about increasing health care at all, about increasing parental leave, about doing any of the things that would make a woman who's pregnant and doesn't have resources not seek an illegal abortion in her state now, if that's the case. Or not try to go travel out of the state to do something that you in the GOP say you would rather they not do. So there was nothing in their agenda, and there still isn't, Mark, as far as I know, that follows up on that and saying, okay, we're going to be pro-life in all of these other ways, which means you have dignity as a human being, and therefore you should get paid right. You should have access to health care. You should have access to all the things you need in order to raise your child.
Yeah, I mean, that's just such a courageous position because it's odd. It shouldn't be courageous, but I guess what I'm saying is normally it's just a headline position. Yeah, get rid of Roe v. Wade. Good. Now now it's Christian values, but the reality is the values really start way past that.
Way past that. And look, the church used to be, it still is in some ways, used to be really good on this, which was for a long time, and not to get you guys deep into Catholic theology. There was this thing they would talk about called the seamless garment of life. An archbishop in Chicago once thought of this, which is, don't look at our abortion stance by itself. It's part of our whole view of what it means to have human dignity from the beginning of life to the end and everywhere in between. Dignity at work, dignity at home, the dignity of the family, dignity in your last days. And so that compelled the church to support a lot of social justice issues, which for many, many years they did. It's only fairly recently that more conservative parts of the church in this country said that, oh no, abortion is the preeminent issue for us. That's the one that we're going to keep hammering and hammering and hammering. The other part, we're not going to talk about. And they still haven't.
The other thing that you talk about, and it's kind of, I think it's relevant because it's about money, is defaulting on the debt and the sort of game of chicken that the GOP is playing. And you say, well, what does that have to do with Catholicism? It's interesting. Again, this goes to Catholic values, as articulated anyway. And the fact that, with this defunding, with sending this country into default potentially, you end up hurting those who the Catholic Church professes anyway to care the most about, that you send them into a tailspin.
Right. So again, whenever the Republicans seem to talk about debt, and they only talk about it when there's a Democratic president, It's all about, well, we have to cut Medicare and Social Security. Now, Biden, as you know, in the State of the Union, got them to pledge, oh, no, we're never going to do that. So we'll see. But there are other ways where they can cut the safety net and still leave Social Security and Medicare alone. So we'll have to take a look. But that's where they go. It's like, okay, how can we further undo the safety net for the most vulnerable? And to say that and say, but I'm a good Christian is a little rough. But that's where they go. And that's where they go all the time.
I'm talking to Joe Ferullo in our last couple of minutes, CEO of the National Catholic Reporter. You know, it's interesting, Joe. I wanted to ask you about a story that Kim had. Multiple Emmy alert. What is that? That he's won more than he has.
If you put him back big, you can see that behind him, he's got so many Emmys, he can't even fit them all in the picture.
Oh my God!
Look at them all.
There's this one here. There we go. That's better.
It's like an embarrassment of Emmys there.
Yeah,
he was a TV journalist with an esteemed television journalist.
Yeah.
Before he gave it up to hang with the men of the cloth, and it is men. We don't have any women. No women in the Catholic at the top. And that's still ways to go on that.
Look, that's another thing that Pope Francis is trying to change. He's appointed some women to major roles in some of the Vatican bureaucracy for the first time, which has gotten everybody all shaky too. So,
in our last minute with Joe Ferullo, I wanted to ask him about something that Kim reported on, which was about the Catholic faith and how it's doing worldwide according to polls. Kim, remind us what the story is there.
The story was that the Catholic faith is supposedly on the decline, but the head of Baylor Institute for Studies of Religion, Byron Johnson, is saying most studies about faith are actually flawed. So it's kind of hard to tell. He says the people responding to surveys, if they don't see their particular denomination listed, then they are lumped in with atheists or agnostics, and that's wrong. So it's hard to know whether religion or faith is more people are kind of not submitting to that, or whether that's not the case.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, I just don't know. I mean, all the studies that I've seen, and they're done by very, very well-respected organizations like the Pew Trust, shows that people are leaving established religious denominations. So if you're not on those lists, then you're probably not one of the. I mean, think of it: the mainline Protestant denominations or Catholic. People are moving away from it. For a while, they were moving to evangelicalism. And even that now seems to have flattened and is beginning to go down, so that you have more and more people who identify as none of the above. And it's unclear where they're going, if they've gone to something else entirely, or they've just taken organized institutional religion out of their lives. That's what seems to be happening. Right.
It feels that just based on anecdotal kind of empirical evidence, don't you think? More people go, well, I believe in a force, or I believe in this, or believe in that, but the organized faith and the traditions of organized faith are beginning to, I think, ebb a bit. Now, I say this a lot, and I'll say it again. I just think that faith does help you through a lot, and the traditions of faith. So not just a belief in, a spirit or whatever it might be, or an energy, but the actual comfort of those traditions and those rituals. It's something that does speak to us as Homo sapiens. Somehow we want it, don't you think, Joe?
No, I totally agree. I mean, honestly, you look at the beginnings of mankind and they've always been there. And look, I think what's happening now is a lot of people who move away from institutions may still feel like I believe in Jesus, and I believe in what he is and what he was and what he continues to be. I just don't believe in an institutional way to approach those teachings and live my life. Leave that up to me. I'll be okay. I don't need you to tell me what to do. But having said that, I agree with you, Mark. I mean, today is Ash Wednesday, which is one of the oldest traditions in the church, and is a way that people remind themselves at least once a year, we're only here for a short time, so make the best of it. And that does mean a lot to people. Listen, if you've ever been to funeral services, that means a lot to people, to be able to find some way to mark the passing of somebody. And lots of other smaller rituals throughout our lives. They really do help. But these don't have to be in conflict, right? You can enjoy all those rituals, find meaning out of them, and still feel that there's a church that listens to you and that can change and evolve with the times.
Yeah.
Those things don't have to be mutually exclusive.
That's a challenge for so many faiths that have been around a long time, to step up and find a parallel with the times. So they can feel, it can feel a little bit out of step.
This is a word from the Lord, and he's not happy.
Okay.
Can I bring up one other story? Is that okay?
Well, we're running into your time, Kim. So
I know, but I'll cut into my time. You have the floor, sir. No, the Southern Baptist. There's a story, a headline. They're kicking out this mega church in Southern California called Saddleback Church because there's a female pastor, and that's the only reason. Just because a woman is leading the way there, and I think I was hoping maybe you could touch on maybe whether people feel disillusioned at things like that. That we talked about homosexuality in the church, and maybe kind of archaic views like this where women can't be leaders or women can't be in positions of power, and whether that may have anything to do with whether people just take their spirituality and go somewhere else, or whether they feel like they can be part of institutionalized religion.
Yeah, I think it has everything to do with it. I mean, especially for younger people. It has everything to do with what you're talking about. People now who are in their mid-30s and younger say, listen, I can make those choices for myself in terms of who I want to welcome into my life or not. You don't have to do that. And they grew up in a world where diversity was a positive, where their friends are diverse, where women are running corporations and nonprofit institutions. So why can't they be more involved in every single facet of life? And it's a big turnoff for them. Our paper, we have about 1 million users a month on our online, and 44% of them, no, almost 50%, are 44 years old or younger. Almost 30% are 34 years old and younger, which is remarkable for any news organization, let alone a Catholic one. And it's because we do a lot of stories about how do we improve the role of women? How are we more welcoming to LGBTQ Catholics? What more can we do for the homeless and the immigrant? And most religions aren't talking about that in this country anymore. People are doing it. There are people on the ground who don't have a microphone or a camera, who roll up their sleeves and do that work. But all you hear from leaders are these more culture war things. And it really, really, really turns people off, but especially younger people.
You can find the National Catholic Reporter at ncronline.org. And it's interesting to read about this cultural and societal and political institution, the Catholic Church, and to see it change or try to change or try to handle a lot of the controversies and also sort of the cultural schisms, that exist. It's really, and schisms is a ding word, I think. But I really love your work, Joe, and I think that one of the things that's so great about your publication is its frankness. It seems like a very honest take on so much. So thank you for being with us. I hope you'll again be a visitor.
I would love to. And thank you guys for talking about these things. A lot of people, it's hard for them to talk about issues of spirituality and faith and how it all intercedes with politics and government, but it's important. So thank you.
Yeah. Joe Ferullo, everybody. Come on. Together for Joe Ferullo. Right on.
I've told you it's never easy being in this business.
The Mark Thompson Show.